We just saw the first stop of the 2025 Swimming World Cup in Carmel, Indiana wrap up. And during that stop, we saw a ton of new World Cup records, new US Open records, and even one world record. So let's take the time and go through all of the events that we saw during that stop, all 34 of them. We're gonna go through event by event and see how each race played out and take a look at the results of each of those. And then at the end, we're gonna look at the overall standings from this stop and give a quick preview as to what we can expect from stop number 2 in Westmont, Illinois in just a few days. And because you guys seemed to enjoy it last time when I did the preview for this stop, we're gonna go back to this style as we look through the results. Perhaps unsurprisingly, with the absence of Summer McIntosh, Lonnie Pallister was able to cruise to the victory here, touching first in a time of 3:54.38, a little over 4 seconds ahead of New Zealand's Erica Fairweather, who was also under that 4-minute barrier in a 3:58.83, and another New Zealander, this one was Caitlin Deans, was just on the bubble of that barrier with a 4:00.93. And real quick, I did mention the absence of Summer McIntosh. Last time before the stop started, we knew that she had withdrawn from this stop, but now we know that she's actually pulling out from the entire World Cup circuit, which honestly really sucks, and I hope she feels better soon because it was for an undisclosed illness. But one last thing for this race, look how insane this race for 3rd through 5th ended up being. In 3rd, we had Caitlin Deans with that 4:00.93, and then Anna Poplawski was a 4:01.03, just within exactly 1/10 away from that time. And then 6/100ths behind Poplawski was Canada's Mary Sophie Harvey. That was an intense battle for those final few spots at the end of that 400-meter race. It's one of the reasons why I really like races over a 400 distance. And speaking of racing over 400 meters, we have the men's 400 freestyle, where Carson Foster actually grabbed the victory here, touching the wall first in a 3:37.80 ahead of Australian Sam Short in a 3:38.15. That is a very impressive win for Foster because Sam Short is really good at the 400-meter distance, so this is a bit of an upset victory if you ask me. Foster also really ended up back-halving this race compared to Short. At the 100, Foster was out in a 52.57, where Short was out ahead in a 51.90, and then at the 200-meter mark, Short was still ahead at a 146.68, and Foster was a 148 flat. And then when we get to the 300-meter turn, Short still has that lead, 242.62 to 243.63, so he's down to 1 second there with just 100 meters to go. And then from that point on, Foster is out splitting on, it looks like, every single 25 after that. So that last 100 meters was a pretty big key critical point of this for this race for him. And in 3rd place, we do have Leon Marchand, only 1/10 behind Sam Short in a 3:38.25. Now this would have been an incredible race, but I do have one gripe here. And that's because Leon Marchand actually swam this in the morning, because 400-meter races, this is the 400 freestyle and the 400 IMs during the World Cup, are actually timed finals. I didn't know that before this stop started. I must have just forgotten that from last year. I thought it was just the 800 and 1500, which does really suck for as tactical of a race as this can be, because Marchand was seeded with a long course time. So he was way down on the psych sheets. He had to swim in the morning. He was swimming all on his own, ripped a really fast time that would have been in contention for the win, and who knows how it would have played out if he was there in the evening. That's why I don't really like it for 400-meter races, because they are so much more tactical compared to something like a 1500. There's obviously strategy, but the strategy is mostly sticking to your own race plan, compared to a 400 where playing off of what the other people in the field are doing when you're going for the win, especially in an in-season meet like this, is a way bigger deal. And also part of this group, kind of in that upper echelon of finishers, was Kieran Smith in 4th place with a 3:38.66. So we had 3 3:38s and then Foster with a 37 high. That was a pretty quick upper end of this. And it's interesting that we have some of the fastest NCAA 500-yard swimmers in attendance here. Carson Foster, Kieran Smith, and Leon Marchand are all very high up, with Marchand holding the record in the all-time rankings. And then Sam Short, we know his pedigree victory in the 400 freestyle and the long course pool. So this is a pretty stacked field when you look at it from most angles. Next up, we have the women's 50 backstroke, where it was Kaylee McEwen with a dominant win, touching almost 0.4 of a second ahead of fellow Australian Molly O'Callaghan, 25.42 to 25.80. And then just 2/100ths behind O'Callaghan was Catherine Burkhoff in a 25.82, and she was only 1/100th ahead of Mexico's Cielo Polito Ortiz with a 25.83. So that was a pretty bunched up field in second, third, and fourth, as Kaylee McEwen was, of course, blasting away everyone else. This field was also notably a little bit weaker than it could have been, which is kind of impressive seeing as how close that racing was. That's because we saw two notable scratches before the prelims in Gretchen Walsh and world record holder Regan Smith, and they both had decent reasons for doing so. Regan Smith had the 200 butterfly later on in the meet, and she prefers to have the 200 butterfly as more of her sole focus. She said that she would prefer the double if it was the 200 butterfly then the 50 backstroke. Since that wasn't the case, she scratched the 50 backstroke. And Gretchen Walsh has said that she would like to swim it at some stop, but actually wasn't expecting her speed to be quite there and wanted to focus more on 100-meter distances. But as we're going to see in a little bit, her speed is just fine, so she might throw down something pretty fast in this 50 backstroke. But seeing how fast Kaylee McEwen was here, it should be an interesting showdown if we see one or both of those back in this event. Sticking in the realm of backstroke, we have the men's 200 backstroke, where #1 seed Hubert Koch was a not very comfortable win, actually, which is kind of surprising. He was incredibly fast with a 1:46.84, but we see Leon Marchand make an appearance again with a second place finish in a 1:47.68, which is pretty quick, pretty close to Koch there, and now makes him the 10th fastest performer in the history of this event. And I will remind you that backstroke is widely considered to be Marchand's weakest of the 4 strokes. And it shows that when you're a true IMer like this, you don't have that weak of a weakest stroke. Rounding out the top 3 here, also dipping under the 150 mark in a 1:49.81 was Shane Casas. And you might notice Hubert Koch, Leon Marchand, Shane Casas, all 3 of those trained together at the University of Texas. This was also our podium in the 200 IM during last summer's long course world championships. Absolutely insane training group just in these 3, and there are actually many, many more in that star-studded Texas group. And another one of those Texas swimmers is the winner of our next event, the women's 200 butterfly, and that is Regan Smith. She was the very clear favorite with the absence of Summer McIntosh, who, by the way, is also now training at Texas, just to keep harping on that for a second. And she set a new World Cup record with a time of 2:00.28, which undercut the old World Cup record set back in 2009 of a 2:00.78. You might recognize that name, Liu Zide, who is the world record holder in the long course 200 butterfly from that same year. So that is quite a name to take down. Now, of course, you can see above that, Summer McIntosh with a 1:59.32 is the current world record holder, but 2:00.28, decent personal best there for Regan Smith as she inches closer and closer to that 2-minute barrier that I'm pretty sure she wants to take down during one of these next 2 stops. Rounding out kind of our podium finishers here behind Smith was Alex Shackle and Ellen Walsh in a 2:02.51 and a 2:05.07. So we can see that Regan Smith had a pretty comfortable margin of victory this time around. Our next event is the men's 100 butterfly, where the World Cup record holder and the world record holder, Noé Ponty, was the first finisher with a 48.53, only a hair off of his World Cup record of 48.40 from last year's World Cups, and a bit further behind his world record of 47.71. About half a second behind him was Ilya Karun, which is honestly a pretty impressive margin of victory for Ponty to have, given how fast Karun has been looking, and Karun was very speedy for his part in a 49.02. And then about another half second behind that was perhaps a surprise podium finisher in Chad Leclos with a 49.57, not just dipping under that 50-second barrier, but kind of blowing right by it. Chad Lecolo always felt like kind of a wild card at this stop because it feels like if there's one thing he does really well is show up and swim really fast when you're not really expecting him to. The thing that stands out the most in my mind was actually last year's World Cup, where at the final stop he won the 200 butterfly, denying Trenton Julian of the Triple Crown, and I honestly was not expecting him to have that fast of a swim at the end of that series. In the women's 200 breaststroke, we saw world record holder Kate Douglas put on a swim clinic with a 2:13.97 to dominate this race, with Anna Eldon in second place in a 2:17.80. That is a very impressive margin of victory for Douglas there, who has some ridiculous records in this event, including a World Cup record of 2:12.72 from last year's World Cup and a world record of 2:12.50 from last year's Short Course World Championships. And we saw Douglas absolutely dismantle this world record last year, and she got faster with every single stop. So if that trend holds true this year, we could see some even more impressive times in the next couple of weeks. Now, with Kate Douglas being as dominant as she is, it's no surprise that she touched first at literally every single wall, first at every single 25 right from the start. The same cannot be said about our second place finisher, Germany's Anna Eldon, who started off a bit more sluggish and built into it. She was fourth at the first 25, then sixth, fifth, third, second, and then second where she ultimately finished. In fact, she had some very impressive closing speed over that final 50 because she was the only swimmer other than Douglas to split under 18 seconds on both those 25 splits. So she was really closing like a freight train at the very end there. And the swimmer she was going by at the end there was South Africa's Rebecca Meader, and Alex Walsh brought up the fourth position as both these swimmers were in the 2:18s, 2:18.14, and 2:18.96. In the men's 100 breaststroke, we saw Kasper Corbeau take the win here over world record holder Ilya Shimanovic, 56.67 to 57.18. Corbeau was out pretty quick, being first of the first 25, then taking the first position and holding on to it, where Shimanovic kind of built into it, starting off in fourth position, then third, and then getting up to second. He actually was outsplit by Corbeau on the final 25, so he is no longer able to make up any ground on him there. And behind those two, we do see the rest of the field bunch up quite a bit. We see in third place Van Mathias in a 57.26, then Jeremiah Pock in a 57.36, Josh Matheny in a 57.39, Finlay Brooks in a 57.49, then Brian Benzing and Shin Ohashi are both 57 highs. And yes, in eighth place, that is our 16-year-old sensation from Japan, Shin Ohashi. He's going to have a much more impressive result later on in the meet in the 200 breaststroke, so we'll get to that in a little bit. The women's 50 freestyle was another one that had a pretty notable scratch, with Gretchen Walsh swimming the prelims but choosing not to contest the finals because she also had the 100 IM. It's notable because she is the world record holder, but in her absence, Kasia Wasik from Poland managed to touch the wall first in a 23.29 with as healthy of a lead, I guess, as you could have in a 50 over Australia's Alexander Perkins, who was a 23.50, with another Aussie, Molly O'Callaghan, in third in a 23.96, as these three were the only swimmers to dip under that 24-second mark. The men's 50 freestyle was an absolute barn burner, with Chris Giuliano managing to flip first as the only swimmer under 10 seconds on the way out in a 9.96, and then hold on at the end, touching the wall in a 20.83. Right behind him was fellow American Jack Alexey, although if you're reading the results, it's actually John Alexey, which sounds weirdly cursed, who was a 20.88. And then we do see Ilya Karun pulling that double with the 100 butterfly in a 20.89. And you may notice while Chris Giuliano was out first and then held on to first, Jack Alexey and especially Ilya actually had to build into it, as they were 5th and 7th at that first turn, both of of which had to really put in some work to make their way onto the podium. And while we didn't see her in the 50 freestyle, this is where we see the first appearance of Gretchen Walsh in the women's 100 IM, where she demolished the old World Cup record with a time of 55.91. The old standard stood from Katinka Hozu with a 56.51, and I believe that also used to be the world record before Gretchen Walsh started taking it down and down and down last year. And also under that old World Cup record was second place finisher Kate Douglas with a 56.34. Gretchen Walsh is, of course, the world record holder with a 55.11 from last year's short course worlds, so seeing that she was within a second of that is pretty impressive. And with those two way out ahead of the rest of the field, a little over a second behind in third was Belgian Roos van Ouderdijk, who was a 57.44. Then to end day one of the meet, we had the men's 100 IM, where we see Shane Costas again, this time at the top of the podium, where he touched first in a 50.86 to be the only swimmer under 51 seconds. Right behind him was Noé Ponty with a 51.13, and then a tie for third from Finlay Knox and Hubert Koch in 51.29. Costas got the early lead and then briefly lost it on the backstroke leg to Hubert Koch, which of people to lose a lead to on backstroke is not the worst thing. Then he takes it back on the breaststroke and maintains it into the freestyle. Meanwhile, Ponty was actually tied for third with Koch at the 50, and then fell to fourth, fifth, and then rallied big time on that freestyle leg to drag himself back up to second. The women's 400 IM saw Abby Wood touch the wall first in a 4:27.14, with Ellen Walsh in second in a 4:28.47, not that far behind, and then Ella Ramsey was in third in a 4:30.25. But what's really interesting here is looking a little bit closer at the splits, because Ellen Walsh was really trying her absolute hardest to run down Abby Wood on that final 100. So if we look at the 300 meter splits, at the 300 meter turn, Wood had a very sizable lead with a 3:23.15. Meanwhile, Walsh was a 3:27.15. And then if we look at 25 meter splits, Walsh was a 16:08 to 16:80. Then Walsh was a 15:22 to 15:75. And then a 15:18 to 16:17. And then 14:84 to 15:27. So she was putting in the work over those final 4:25s as she massively chopped down that lead to be within striking distance right at the end. But with such a sizable lead from Abby Wood over the first 300 meters, you just run out of pool at a certain point. Then we have the men's 1500 freestyle, and I know you can't see all the results. I cannot fit all the splits on one screen without it being actually microscopic. But here we saw Sam Short with a pretty dominant victory of a 14:30.00, and you might be surprised by the name in second place there from Carson Foster with a very respectable 14:41.33, and then another Carson, this time Carson Hick, rounding out third in a 14:55, also .00, because I guess these two were just like to make the times look a little fake. The way this race ended up playing out was just the fact that Short just kind of managed to slowly increase his lead over Foster as Foster slowly distanced himself from the rest of the field. But it was really cool to see Carson Foster actually race this event, which is pretty neat to see him branch out into something else. Next, in the men's 50 backstroke, we have maybe one of the more absurdly split races we'll see here, because Hubert Koch was out in fifth, tied for fifth actually, at the first 25, and then rallied to not just win this event, but win it by nearly 0.3 of a second, because he somehow managed to negative split a 50. It was out in an 11:33 and then back in an 11:32. I know it's backstroke. It is slightly easier to negative split a 50 in a backstroke. I will give you that, but it still shouldn't be very doable. And as I said, Koch had a pretty dominant win of 22.65 over Ralph Trimitov's 22.91, and then Dylan Carter was just on the cusp of breaking that 23-second barrier with a 23.00, and Kasper Sikowski was right on his tail with a 23.06, and Aiden Hayes a 23.08. So it was really bunched up behind the massive lead that Hubert Koch had. Actually, what's really interesting about these three, I'm talking about Dylan Carter, Kasper Sikowski, and Aiden Hayes, is the fact that Carter and Sikowski were tied for second, and then Hayes was 1/100th behind them, 11.28 to 11.29. So that was a bit of a scramble at the very end there to get the final touch over the second 25. The women's 200 freestyle saw long course standout in this event, Molly O'Callaghan, dominate her way to the top with a 150.77 ahead of fellow Australian Lonnie Pallister in a 152.41. Now that 150.77 is knocking on the door of Sarah Sostrom's World Cup record of 150.43, and honestly is in the conversation of Siobhan Hahi's world record of 150.31. 150.77 is very quick. In fact, one thing that really interests me with honestly most of the international swimmers, but especially the Australians, and I guess any swimmers from Asia as well, is how much faster they'll get as the meets go on, because they are most likely going to be the most affected by any kind of time change and jet lag, just because the time zones they're coming from are way further away than European swimmers. But they're also going to be affected as well, and sometimes it can just take you a bit of time to acclimate to that extreme time change, especially when you're trying to perform at a very high athletic level. So that could be something that we see really turbocharge any kind of improvement over the 3 stops in 3 weeks. Rounding out the podium, we saw Anna Poplawski hold off a charging Erica Fairweather 153.08 to a 153.33, as Fairweather had a very fast closing 25 of 14.05, which is the third fastest in the entire field, but Poplawski had built up enough of a lead to hold on to that third place position. And in perhaps one of the biggest upsets of the entire meet, we saw the men's 200 IM, where Leon Marchand is the reigning world record holder set during last year's World Cup. But he touched in second, not because he was going slow. He went the 5th fastest time in the history of this event with a 149.73. But unfortunately, his training partner Shane Casas was a bit faster with a 149.43, which is a new American record that he used to own from last year's short course world championships. So yeah, this was an incredibly fast race between these two as they both dipped under 150. Just an absolute barn burner. And honestly, maybe the most impressive thing from this win out of Casas is the fact that he had touched first at every single wall. He didn't even have Marchand catch him on the breaststroke leg. In fact, he even outsplit him overall. They were very close on both 25s. On the first one, it was 15.87 to 15.94, and then 16.35 to 16.32. So Marchand got him a bit on that second 25, but it wasn't enough to make up the overall difference. And this was a super impressive swim out of Casas. Taking down Marchand is no easy feat, especially when he's going fast. Because again, it's not like he had a super off horrible swim. He was a 149.7. Just when Casas is going to 149.4, he's going to win. And then in a somewhat distant third, we did have David Schlitt, who touched third in a 153.09, a little bit overshadowed by the fireworks in the top 2 spots here. We didn't see world record holder in the 50 backstroke Reagan Smith swim that event on night 1, but she's also the world record holder in the 100 backstroke, and she did swim that on night 2, where she got the win over Kaylee McEwen. 54.92 to 55.05. A very tight race between these backstroke titans, as Regan Smith gets a somewhat rare victory over McEwen for her. In fact, this is actually the first head-to-head, so not a relay leadoff, victory over McEwen for Smith in 6 years. McEwen had the faster bookends of this race, going out faster on the first 25 and then closing a bit faster on the final 25, but Regan Smith was faster through the middle of the race, and she was faster by a little bit more than McEwen was on the beginning and ends. Then a surprise to me was Bella Sims actually picking up the 3rd place finish over Catherine Burkhoff, who I kind of expected to end up in that spot, and she was only 2/10 behind McEwen, which is crazy impressive given just how fast McEwen and Regan Smith are. Bella Sims recently made the change from training at the University of Florida over to the University of Michigan in this past year. So is this a sign that that change is paying off? I have no idea, and honestly, probably no one does because it's a little early to tell, but this is a very promising sign so far. In the men's 50 breaststroke, we saw a very narrow finish through the top 3 spots as South Africa's Chris Smith got a narrow 3/100th victory over Casper Corbeau, 25-75 to 25-78. And then only 1/100th behind Corbeau was Ilya Shimanovic in a 25-79. And rounding out these more distant top 4, it was Finlay Brooks in a 25-88. So a very tight race through the faster half of this heat. And then of course, this right here is the big one. The women's 50 butterfly, where we saw Gretchen Walsh break her own world record in the event by 0.2 of a second, as she ripped a 23.72 to break her own world record of 23.94 and net herself a nice $10,000 bonus for doing so. She also managed to win this event by almost a full 7, 23.72 down to 24.64 and then a 25.44, as she was massively removed from the rest of this field in an absolutely dominant display, which is made all the more impressive given the fact that it's only a 50-meter race. I will remind you, if we look at that time of 23.72, remember that the next fastest time from anyone not named Gretchen Walsh is a 24.38. That is a ridiculous degree of separation, and Gretchen Walsh now owns the 5 fastest swims in history. The 3 swims she swam at last year's short course world championships, her prelim swim at this World Cup stop of 24.13, and then of course this new world record. She has 5 official short course meters 50 butterfly swims, and they are numbers 1 through 5 on the all-time rankings. I don't know if that's ever happened before in an event. We see the return of Jack Alexi, who I just realized is actually Jack Alexi and not John Alexi anymore. That must have been entered under his government name on night 1 and then got updated in the results for night 2. That is hilarious, as he had a pretty convincing victory in the men's 100 freestyle with a 45.32, as just narrowly the only swimmer under the 46-second barrier, with Chris Giuliano at a 46.00, Kai Winkler in a 46.11, and Grant House in a 46.24. Perhaps fitting for someone that did win the 50 on the first night, Chris Giuliano had the early lead through the first 50 meters in a 21.67, with Jack Alexi lurking right behind in a 21.81, but then Alexi turned it up to 11 over the second 50, outsplitting Giuliano by a pretty decent margin on each 25 to have that margin of victory that he ended up with. And that's not too dissimilar from the way that Jack Alexi actually swims his 100 freestyles in long course. He normally hangs closer to the middle of the pack and then uses those nice long arms to build his way through to a pretty strong finish. Kate Douglas backed up her win in the 200 breaststroke with a win in the 100 breaststroke as the only swimmer to break the 103 barrier in a 102.90, and is now within striking distance of the world record of 102.36, which also stands as the World Cup record and has been equaled a few times here. Douglas ended up having quite a bit of a race with Estonia's Anneli Jefomova, as she was actually the leader through the first 225s before Douglas eventually built to the lead to go by her, which makes sense events as the dominant 200 breaststroker that she is. Rounding out our podium finishers is Anna Eldent with a 103.83, as just like her swim earlier in the 200 breaststroke, she kind of built her way through the ranks, first being 6th, then 5th, and then staying in 3rd through the back half of the race, and she was the only other swimmer under 104. The men's 200 butterfly ended up being a very thrilling race, especially through the back half of that race. Through the first half, Ilya Karun was in a pretty controlled first position, with Trenton Julian often lurking not that far behind. At the 100-meter turn, it was Julian in a 52.95, and then Karun a little bit ahead in a 52.80. Karun managed to maintain that lead into the 125 turn, but then Julian took it at the 150 turn. Then at the 175 turn, it was Gabriel Jett inserting himself to the conversation after previously being 5th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 3rd, and then 1st. And then Karun had the fastest final 25 to touch the wall first as the only swimmer under 151 in a 150.65. Gabriel Jett managed to hang on through those final 25 meters in the second position with a 151.01, and then a little bit behind them was Italian Federico Burdisso in a 152.06, as Trenton Julian ended up fading to 4th in a 152.17. The men's 400 IM was maybe another race where we were robbed of a more exciting race due to the timed finals nature of it. Carson Foster was the top finisher with a time of 3:59.58 as the only swimmer under 4 minutes. Then behind him in a 4:01.82 was Japan's Tomoruki Matsushita with a 4:01.82. Then in 3rd was Shane Casas in a 4:03.10. Now Casas, of course, was just the victor in the 200 IM, and he was swimming in the morning, so he was not in any kind of a race with these top 2 swimmers. Now, of course, Casas is a bit further back than Marchand was in the 400 freestyle, so it's not really a given that he would have suddenly been a 400 or anything like that, but just when a swimmer from the morning heat is this far up into the rankings in a 400 meter distance, especially an IM race where more tactics can kind of be at play, I can't help but wonder if something would have played out a little bit differently if it was a standard prelims finals affair. Our women's distance race for this stop was the 800 freestyle, where Lonnie Pallister had a pretty dominant win here with a time of 8:02.02, just off of her personal best time of 8:01.95, and she had over 10 seconds on Erica Fairweather, who was an 8:12.57, and then Caitlin Deans was a 8:13.37, just behind Fairweather. And if you were paying attention, you'll notice this is our exact same podium as the women's 400 freestyle. Now, one really interesting part of this race is the fact that Lonnie Pallister was kind of flirting with that world record line for about half of it, being a decent ways under at the 100 and 200 meter turns, and then about half a second under at the 400 meter turn before the world record line slowly ate her up and then went by her. Pallister won't be swimming this event at the next stop. For the women, their distance event is going to be the 1500, but at the 3rd stop in Toronto and the final stop, she will have another crack at this 800 freestyle. And I still can't help but wonder if she can maybe fine-tune things, see how she split that race, adjust a little bit more to the drastic change in time zone, and maybe give that world record line a run for its money. I definitely want to see if she can at least break 8 minutes. Gretchen Walsh was back to doing Gretchen Walsh things in the women's 100 butterfly as she touched the wall first in a time of 53.69, setting a new World Cup record. In a pretty distant second place was Alexander Perkins in a 54.93, and then Roos van Ouderdijk was in 3rd with a 55.64. Gretchen Walsh, of course, owns this world record with a time of 52.71 set during last year's short course world championships. And a reminder, she was a 53.69 here. That world record's a 52. She is the only woman to ever break 54 seconds, and while she's done it, she's also broken 53 seconds because she is absolutely insane in both short course and butterfly events. The men's 50 butterfly was an absolutely electric race with Ilya Karun and Noé Ponty both breaking 22 seconds, but Karun got the touch, 21.86 to 21.90, just 4/100ths of a second apart, which is impressive for crewing over the world record holder in Ponty, who has a world record time of 21:32. And these two were a ways ahead of the rest of the field, with Thomas Chacon and Josh Liendo in third and fourth with times of 22:36 and 22:56. It was really a two-man race, especially after that turn. While Regan Smith got the better of Kaylee McEwen in the 100 backstroke, McEwen returned the favor in the 200 backstroke, taking down the world record holder in the event by a pretty sizable margin. She was the only swimmer under 2 minutes, and she did it by quite a bit, clocking a time of 1:58.86, which is a new personal best time for McEwen, which is impressive because she used to hold the world record in this event. Smith was in second with a 2:00.07, just off of that 2-minute barrier, and then Charlotte Crush was in third with a 2:02.28. Pretty impressive finish for the younger swimmer. One thing I noticed about this race, the way it played out, is the fact that Regan Smith really wasn't putting the pressure on McEwen even from the beginning. She was third, fourth, third, and third through the first 100 meters. This is a race that she normally needs to try and win from the very front because McEwen is typically going to close faster than her. So far, she hasn't really been able to play McEwen's game and win. She needs to be out ahead if she wants to try and take her down, which is pretty much how she swam her world record swims in this event. Actually, surprisingly, was that third place finisher, Charlotte Crush, who was leading through the first 75 meters and was right with the leaders through the first 100, which again was kind of unexpected and pretty cool to see as she tried to play spoiler and shake up that dynamic. McEwen was also incredibly close to Regan Smith's World Cup record of 1:58.83. She's just 3/100ths behind in that 58.86, though she's of course a bit further away from that world record of 1:58.04. It'll be interesting to see how much faster both of these swimmers can get through the next two stops. I hope we see some more epic backstroke battles through the remaining two stops. It was another pretty dominant backstroke win for Hubert Koch in the men's 100 backstroke as he touched first on all four walls, ending up with a time of 49.08 ahead of Kasper Sikowski in a 49.92, and then long course world record holder Thomas Chacon was third in a 50.20. And this was a very dominant win for Koch, as you can tell just from those final times, but also the way he swam it. He had the fastest 25 on all four, except for the very last one where one swimmer was faster, and that is Chacon, who was only 2/100ths faster, 12.66 to 12.68. No one else beat him on that final 25 split, and no one else beat him on the other three, period. So he was very dominant throughout all four lengths of this race. In the women's 50 breaststroke, we saw Anneli Jefomova end up with a 29.33 to touch the wall first, then Florine Gaspard from Belgium was a 29.58 for second, and Anna Eldon rounded out the podium with a 29.80 in third. Actually, one funny thing looking at the splits of this race here is the fact that there's no movement between the first and second 25s. The first touch at the 25 ended up first overall, then second is second, third is third, fourth is fourth, fifth is fifth. There's a tie for sixth, but they just stayed sixth and seventh, and then eighth was eight. Normally, at least see some swimmers kind of move up or down. It's kind of funny they all stayed 1 for 1 in this event. Leanne Marchand almost missed the final of the men's 200 breaststroke in the morning, but just snuck into it and ended up swimming this race from lane 8 with a bit of outside smoke, and ended up having a pretty epic battle with Kasper Corbeau, who already won the 100 breaststroke and got a very narrow second in the 50 breaststroke, and he managed to hold on to win another breaststroke event over Marchand with a 2:01.63 to a 2:02 flat. Marchand was closing hard over the final 50 meters as he outsplit Corbeau by decent amounts on both those 25s, but he was a little too deep in the hole to actually make it back on him, as these two were the standout finishers among the rest of the field. And I told you we were going to see a more impressive finish out of the Japanese phenom Shin Ohashi, and this is time for that, as he ended up in third in a 2:04.07, right ahead of Josh Matheny in a 2:04.26. And Ohashi really just worked his way from the back up to the front. He was 7th, 7th, 6th, sixth, 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 fourth, and then third. So he really started working over those final few laps. Ohashi is a swimmer that we saw improve pretty quickly through multiple back-to-back meets during last summer's long course season. Between that and potential time zone issues, I can't help but wonder how much faster he might get over the next couple of weeks, especially because this was the only stop that Marchand was racing in. So if you remove him from the conversation, he's kind of in the defending second place position for the next stop. The winner of the 100 and 200 breaststroke, Kate Douglas, decided to take on the very common third event for someone who wins those, the 100 freestyle, as she won her third event of this stop with a time of 50.83, ahead of Molly O'Callaghan, who again is very accomplished in the long course version of this event, making it a pretty difficult battle for Douglas, and impressive that she managed to pull it off, 50.83 to 51.13, as they were both pretty speedy here. Douglas is actually not super far off of that World Cup record time of 50.58. And then in third place we had Marit Steenbergen in a 51.56, and she was the only other swimmer to break 52 seconds. Taylor Ruck in fourth was very close with a 52.01. World record holder in the men's 200 freestyle, Luke Hobson, ended up winning the event here in Carmel. He was trailing in fourth and then second through the first half of the race, but then at the 125 turn took over first position and maintained it from there, as he was ahead of Chris Giuliano in a 141.58. We also saw Matt Richards in a 141.76, Grant House in a 141.80, then Jack Alexi in a 142.16. Alexi was leading through the first half of the race and then slowly kind of fell behind as other swimmers who are a little more geared towards that 200 slowly passed by him. We saw our first win for Gretchen Walsh's sister, Alex Walsh, in the women's 200 IM, as she was lurking in third after both the butterfly and backstroke legs. Then she took over first after the breaststroke leg and was able to hold on to touch first in a 204.76, ahead of Abby Wood in a 205.14. Then Rebecca Meter was a 205.56, as she actually set a new African record with that time. And that was actually our last event from this first stop, so let's take a look at our current standings. Now, for a little bit of a refresher, each swimmer has a maximum of 3 events that can be scored. They're scored roughly out of 20. You can score up to 10 points for winning an event, and then there's another component of the score that's based off of how good the swim is. It's based off of the number of aqua points, where 1,000 points equals the world record. That's cut down to being roughly out of 10. If you go enough by a world record, you can be more than 10. I think, for example, Gretchen Walsh's 50 butterfly scored her like 10.2 points on that half of it. And speaking of Gretchen Walsh, she is a very narrow leader after this first stop, 59.1 points over Kate Douglas's 58.9 points. So just 0.2 points separating these two, as they each won 3 events, and the main tiebreaker is just how many aqua points their swims ended up being worth. That world record definitely helped Gretchen Walsh pick up that win for this stop over Douglas, but there's 2 more stops to go and Douglas might try and get back at her. And then it is decently bunched up in third, fourth, and fifth, with Kaylee McEwen being just 1/10 ahead of Reagan Smith, and then Reagan Smith is only 2/10 ahead of Lonnie Pallister. So this could also be an interesting shakeup as the stops go on. Hubert Koch currently has a comfortable lead over on the men's side of things, as he is the only man that swept all 3 events, and his score of 58.4 over Casper Corbeau's 55.8 kind of reflects that. Then we see Carson Foster and Ilya Haroun in a 55.4. Carson Foster wins the tiebreaker because I believe his best swim was worth more aqua points. There is a tiebreaker in place, and I'm like 95% sure that's what it is. That's why he's marked as third and Karun as fourth, rather than both being third. And then Shane Casas is a 53.8. Now, one thing to note, while Koch does seem to have a pretty comfortable lead right now, it's not impossible for Corbeau or anyone else to try and catch him. One thing to take note of is the fact that Corbeau barely lost that 50 breaststroke race, and that would have been worth 2 additional points if he had been just a few hundredths faster, which means that he could have been at a 57.8, much closer to that 58.4, though not as close as we're seeing over on the women's side of things. Another thing to maybe think about is the fact that Shane Costas is actually planning on swimming a few more backstroke events at the next stop than he did at this stop, and there is a chance that he could get the better of Kosh in one or more of those and knock his points down a little bit, which would again open up the door for Corbeau or honestly even Costas to try and make a move. We could see a lot more shifting of the order on the men's side, whereas the women's side, I'm assuming Gretchen Walsh and Kate Douglas are going to be locked in that battle for first for basically the entire series. We saw the same thing last year, but except that time it was Kate Douglas and Regan Smith, with Douglas winning by I think just 1/10 of a point, thanks in part to an insane 200 breaststroke world record at the final stop. So there's still a lot of racing to be done to see who wins the $100,000 series grand prize at the end of the 3 stops. Now we are going to see some new additions at the next stop in Westmont, Illinois. A lot of NCAA swimmers for whatever reason, probably just to do with their dual meet schedules. We're going to see the likes of Katie Grimes, Claire Curzon, and Anna Moschk, who are some UVA women's swimmers who are all pretty quick. Anna Moschk in that 200 freestyle was looking pretty good in the NCAA, so she might be another factor in that pretty loaded women's field with Molly O'Callaghan and Lonnie Pallister. Katie Grimes can be a threat in that 400 IM as well, and honestly, any of these swimmers could be a threat to spoil any potential triple crowns. Because remember, anyone that won an event in the first stop is now setting themselves up to win a triple crown if they win it at all 3. These swimmers might try and play spoiler. Now, I'm also excited to see 2 more UVA swimmers, Maximus Williamson and Thomas Heilman. These are both freshmen and are both very highly ranked. Thomas Heilman was on the Paris Olympic team. Maximus Williamson and Thomas Heilman have both thrown down some ridiculous times in short course yards as high schoolers, have been pretty quick in long course meters. It'll be interesting to see what they can do in short course meters. One, just as a, hey, how are they fitting in with UVA, and 2, how much can their fast yards time translate over to short course meters. One of the additions I'm the most excited for is Indiana's Zaylen Sarkany, because he is going to be another swimmer in those distance races to try and push Sam short. He was kind of on his own in the 1500. We're going to see it go down to an 800 freestyle for the men at the next stop, which could make it a bit more competitive, and we add in a very fast swimmer like him, who's also been looking pretty good at some dual meet action. That could be a very interesting battle, and I'm going to keep my eye out for that one. And 2 more of our notable NCAA additions are the Chmielewski brothers from USC. Both of them will be in the 200 butterfly in particular. Christoph's been very fast at that, and Michael is also decently quick. And with how fast and dynamic that race was with Ilya Karoun, Gabriel Jett, Trenton Julian, adding these 2 in the mix could make it just downright crazy in Westmont, so I'm pretty excited for that one too. Another interesting thread for us to try and follow in the next couple of days here is whether or not Carson Foster is actually going to be swimming at these next 2 stops. He didn't originally plan on doing that and was not entered, and currently does not appear on the psych sheets for Westmont, but he said that he's kind of changed his mind and is maybe interested in doing it, so he's trying to see if he can get entered in. Honestly, World Aquatics could do it if they want to, and seeing as he just won 2 events and has 2 potential triple crowns in the 400 freestyle and 400 IM, and was a decent swimmer to watch in that 1500, which will be the 800, I hope that he's able to swim it, because that'll be an interesting shakeup, and again, to add into that 800 freestyle with Sam Short and Zaylen Sarkany. And if he does swim those other 2 stops, he is going to keep that same event lineup, which apparently he chose so that way he could only swim once per day, only in the evening, which I honestly think is hilarious. As much as I was complaining about that in the 400 freestyle and 400 IM, if that's working for him, I can't help but respect it. And honestly, I can't even blame him. Only swimming in the evening in a prelims finals meet is awesome. I got to do it a couple of times in the 1650 when I was in college, and it was 10 out of 10 would recommend. And that was every single event from the first stop of racing at the 2025 Swimming World Cup. The first stop in Carmel, Indiana, and now we're going on to Westmont, Illinois, and again, just a few days here, which should hopefully be just as exciting, if not more, than that first stop. Like I said at the start, however long ago that was, you guys enjoyed this longer form, unscripted style of content that I did during the preview for the first stop, so I'm going to keep experimenting with it and see what kind of topics we're able to cover in this kind of looser style. It's pretty fun for me to do, and if you guys keep enjoying watching it, I'll keep making it. But let me know what races you're most excited to see during the second stop of the Swimming World Cup, and give me your hot takes for who's going to win or lose any given events. I'd love to hear them. Let me know down below.